Good afternoon to the participants in Jakarta, and good morning to the participants in Ireland. Welcome to the Indonesia-Ireland virtual public discussion titled Building Bridges Indonesia and Ireland Perspectives on the War in Gaza. My name is Aurelia Huang, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's event. This public discussion is brought to you by the Foreign Policy Community of Indonesia and the Embassy of Ireland in Indonesia. With the ongoing conflict in Palestine, the vast geographical separation between Indonesia and Ireland offers a distinct perspective in viewing the conflict. This discussion, therefore, aims to facilitate the exchange of ideas, experiences, and best practices in settling the conflict. Today, I am pleased to welcome over 200 participants from 23 countries tuning in to our channel. To name some but not all, participants from Indonesia, Ireland, the United States, the Philippines, Malaysia, Slovakia, Mali, and others. I have the pleasure to welcome our esteemed panelists, Mr. Barry Colfer, Director of Research at the Institute of International and European Affairs, IIEA, Pak Broto Wardoyo, Lecturer at the University of Indonesia, Pak Nostalgiawan Wahyudi, Researcher at the National Research and Innovation Agency, RIN. Thank you for joining us. Today's discussion will be moderated by our founder and chairman, Dr. Dino Patijala. Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, please welcome Dr. Dino. Dr. Dino, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and I want to welcome everybody who's joining us in this very interesting discussion from Indonesia and from countries around the world, and special thanks to Ambassador Padraig from the Embassy of Ireland in Jakarta, who's working with FPCI to organize this event. FPCI is the largest grassroots foreign policy group in Indonesia, Southeast Asia, and the Indo-Pacific. And today we have yet another webinar on the issue of Palestine, which, as everyone would understand, is a huge and the number one foreign policy issue in Indonesia. It's not easy to find a foreign policy issue that Indonesians care about, but certainly one issue that is mentioned on a daily basis and reported on the media, print and electronic, and discussed in mosques, in coffee shop around Indonesia. And that's the Palestine issue, and especially what's happening to Gaza at the moment. There's a lot of talk about double standards or inconsistency in terms of Western response to Palestine, but certainly that doesn't apply to Ireland because we have seen there has been very strong positions taken up by the government of Ireland and also by the general public towards Palestine. And this is why we have taken the initiative to start this webinar today. And I'm very happy that we have Dr. Barry from IIEA to discuss this, to explain the Ireland's position on the Palestine issue. And I'm also very grateful to Pak Broto and Pak Wahyudi for joining this discussion as well. So maybe I'll start with the first question to Dr. Barry. If you can just share with us what's going on in Ireland. I mean, you're not Muslims, you are predominantly Catholic. In Indonesia, I must say, although this is not a religious issue, obviously, it's a political issue, but a lot of Indonesians pay sympathy to the plight of Palestinians because they are seen to be Muslims. So there's that angle to it here. But why is it that there's such strong feeling and support in Ireland towards Palestine issue? Can you explain? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And you're right, Ireland isn't a predominantly Muslim country, but I still wish you Ramadan Mubarak, and I'm happy to wish you all a belated happy Easter, which we celebrated last weekend. So I'm going to do my best, first of all, to introduce myself. Barry Colfer is my name, and I'm the Director of Research at the Institute of International and European Affairs, which is the main public policy think tank in Dublin. Before trying to explain the unique perspective, I would say, on the Palestinian question in Ireland. I just want to say a few words of thanks. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be here. Thanks very much to the FPCI for the kind invitation, and indeed to Ambassador Pádraig Francis for facilitating this connection. And I just want to briefly acknowledge Cian Fitzgerald and Dylan Marshall from the IIEA research team who helped to prepare me for this discussion. So this conversation obviously comes at a really important moment in the crisis in the Middle East. As the violence continues, as Gazans experience starvation, as the risk of sustained regionalization of the conflict continues to grow to Lebanon, to Yemen, to Iran, and elsewhere. And I'm going to take a few moments now to answer your question, to try and set out why Ireland has, I think, fairly been described as one of the most pro-Palestinian countries in the world. Why that is, countries separated by 4,000 kilometers. Why is there this historic solidarity and these historic connections? So to start with, Ireland maintains diplomatic relations with both Israel and Palestine, but has indeed long held out strong support for Palestine. This stems from a combination of factors, predictably. This includes Ireland's historical experience, political advocacy and agency, humanitarian activities, and indeed a sense of social solidarity, which I'm going to try to explain. In one way, this support can be seen through a post-colonial lens. Ireland is unusual in being a Western European country that is also a former colony. Thus, Ireland's stance and support towards Palestine is partly influenced by this historical experience of colonialism and its struggle for independence, the Republic of Ireland breaking away from the United Kingdom in 1921. So we're 100 years old 3 years ago. The Irish government and many Irish political parties from different parties across the political spectrum and different political traditions have also displayed a sustained interest in the region. In 1969, former Irish Foreign Minister Frank Aiken, who's one of the icons of the first decades of Ireland's independence, described the plight of the Palestinian refugees following the 6 Days War as the main and most pressing objective of Ireland's fledgling Middle East policy. In 1980, Ireland became the first European Economic Community as it was then, member state, to endorse the establishment of a Palestinian state. In 2014, both houses of the Irish Parliament, the upper house and the lower house, in the Oireachtas, which is the term for our joint houses of Parliament, passed motions to recognise the state of Palestine, but the government has failed to do so yet, waiting until a bloc of EU countries forms to move together with and until, quote, the Palestinian Authority is in full and sole control over its territories. I'll come back to this again briefly in my closing remarks. I'm going to speak for maybe 3 more minutes, Chair. Support for Palestine in Ireland is not only associated with, but it is strongly associated with Irish republicanism. Irish republicanism has maintained strong links with Palestine, but also with the likes of the Kurds and the Basques and other independence movements. Indeed, in 2022, Mary Lou McDonald, who is the leader of the opposition Sinn Féin party, which is on the Republican left of the Irish political spectrum, and indeed is seen by many as a government in waiting, described Palestinian issues and affairs as being among her party's top foreign policy priorities. Even just this, that it is seen the Palestinian question as among the top foreign policy priorities of any party in Europe, stands out. But it's important to note that support is far from limited to politics. Starkly, according to Amnesty International, polling carried out by Ireland Thinks, a respected polling company, in January of this year, showed that 71% of people in Ireland agree that, quote, Palestinian people live under a system of, quote, apartheid implemented against them by Israel. So very stark language afoot in Irish public discourse. More recently, there was support for a boycott of the South by Southwest Music Festival in the US by Irish artists due to the festival's connections with US armed forces and arms sales to Israel. And indeed, Taoiseach, that's our term for Prime Minister, it's the Irish word for chief, Leo Varadkar, quick sidebar, he's just about to leave office, having announced his resignation last week. During the annual St. Patrick's Day visit to Washington, he said that Israel were subjecting innocent men, women, and children to collective punishment and emphasized the need for an immediate ceasefire in the current conflict and a massive increase in humanitarian aid to Gaza, as well as the need to work for a meaningful political pathway to self-determination for the Palestinian people. This language possibly feels uncontroversial to an Indonesian audience. Indeed, it is uncontroversial to an Irish audience also, but it is among the starkest language uttered by political leaders in the West and certainly within the European Union. And aside from these matters of history and sentiment, which are really important, in practical terms, Ireland provides considerable humanitarian assistance to Palestine, including through core funding to the UN Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA. Wrapping up my introductory remarks, and to provide some final bit of context, Ireland also has an unbroken record of serving with UN peacekeeping missions since the country's first deployment in 1958. And there is absolutely familiarity with the region through Ireland's contribution to UNDOF, that's the UN Disengagement Observer Force in the Golan Heights, and UNIFIL, the nation's interim force in Lebanon. The Irish forces have recently withdrawn from UNDOF and have been consolidated in UNIFIL, and this, at present, some 10% of Ireland's armed forces are currently in Lebanon through involvement in these missions, including in the appropriately named Camp Shamrock in southern Lebanon. Shamrock being the emblem of Ireland, kind of it historically representing the Holy Trinity of the Christian faith. Two final remarks, and in addition, in terms of the wider geopolitical context, it's important to remember when trying to understand how Ireland views the conflict in Palestine, but indeed conflict anywhere, is that Ireland remains to date devoutly militarily neutral. I pause quickly because there's a hot debate in Europe, obviously, given the ongoing atrocious war in Ukraine, as well as the conflict in Gaza, about where the remaining handful of neutral countries in Europe stand when it comes to conflict. But perhaps that's for another discussion on another day. But Ireland did not participate officially in World War II, although plenty of Irish people did. Some 80,000 fought the British forces in that conflict. And Ireland is not a member of NATO. And so this fact of Ireland's military neutrality, the fact that the new Irish state in the 1930s and 40s was not officially involved in World War II, being neutral, this helps to shape the country's worldview, and indeed has helped to historically shape its relations with both Israel and Palestine through its non-direct involvement in World War II. And finally, but importantly, regarding the view from Ireland of the current atrocious situation in Gaza, but indeed equivalent situations around the world, not least because of the post-colonial lens through which things are seen in Ireland, it is also important to note and to seek to understand the place that hunger plays in Irish history and Irish politics. The Great Famine, or An Gcúirta Mór as it's referred to in Ireland in the 1840s, is a defining feature of modern Irish history. Alongside independence from the UK in 1921 and Ireland joining the European Union in 1973, I argue that this period of famine in the 1840s are the three defining moments, events, periods in modern Irish history and modern Irish politics. Indeed, today, Ireland is the only Western country whose population today is below what it was in the 1840s, as some 2 million people either left or died from starvation. Now, this is also a whole chapter that is worth another discussion. But part of this famine and the devastating effects that it had on Irish society, on Irish industry, and on the Irish soul and the Irish political context is that this was partly exacerbated by what is seen by many as neglect from Britain and attempts to alleviate the effects of the famine were consciously not taken by Britain at the time. Remember, Ireland was a constituent part of the United Kingdom of Britain and Ireland. So this sense of the kind of political dimension of starvation and the effect it had on modern Ireland, but also the fact that, for example, Ireland has such a major influence in American politics and other parts of the world because so many Irish people left our shores, and this kind of sense of migration and the great loss that goes with that, but also the devastating impact of starvation and hunger is really present in Irish public discourse. And when Volker Turk, the UN human rights chief, recently described how starvation in Gaza has been used by Israel as a weapon of war, quote. This resonates with an Irish audience. And so for these and other reasons, the political dimension, the post-colonial dimension, the familiarity with the region through the deployment of Irish forces in Lebanon and in the region, but also the sense of hunger and the role that it can play in defining a people and its losses. For these and other reasons, many people in Ireland maintain strong support for Palestine. Now, there's more I could say, and maybe I'll have the chance, Chair, during our discussions, to try and locate the Irish context within the wider European context. But just to answer your question about where the situation currently is in Ireland and why Ireland perhaps has this historical affinity with the people of Palestine, I'll leave it there. Thanks a million.
Yeah. Thank you, Barry. I was quite interested to hear about the policy of neutrality of Ireland, and I wasn't. I just wasn't aware of it, and I found that very interesting. But before we move on to go deeper on the Israel-Palestine issue, can you explain to us what is the origin of this policy of neutrality of Ireland? Yeah.
I can do my best. And I often describe this policy of neutrality, which you have in Ireland, as something to which there is a theological attachment. So if one looks at neutrality in different parts of the world, so within the European Union, there's really a handful of neutrals left after the accession of Sweden and Finland to NATO. You have Ireland, you have Austria, and you have Cyprus, sort of, but Cyprus is its own very specific context with its British military bases on the island. The policy of Irish neutrality dates back to the country's independence, its breaking with the United Kingdom in 1921. This was following an uprising in 1916, a brief war of independence, and a brief civil war. I say brief, but they were still bloody and terrible. When the Irish state took its first steps as an independent country in 1921, partly to swear off from armed conflict, partly to stand up against what was British imperialism at the time, and to distinguish ourselves from the United Kingdom, Ireland became devoutly neutral from that point on. I'll say one or two further things. In the 1930s and 40s, when war was in Europe, Ireland maintained its status of neutrality, but I mentioned lots of Irish people did fight, but for different armies. And within the Irish context, when there was either Allied or Axis soldiers, airmen who ended up landing on the island of Ireland, there was tacit support for the Allies. So in those instances, the Irish authorities would pass British or Allied forces back to the Allies, but would maintain under incarceration the handful of Axis airmen who landed in Ireland or on Irish territory by accident. So whilst Ireland has been neutral, there's always been tacit support for Western allies, particularly during World War II. Now, to conclude on your question about Irish neutrality, because that was then and now is now. Back then, it was a defining feature of Ireland's independence. It was partly to, stand up against British imperialism and also to declare an attachment to peace. Those things still hold now, but it's important to understand the wider context, not just with the war in Ukraine, Russia's terrible full-scale invasion of that country in 2022, and the wider European context. Obviously, its security context has been changed by this. Allied to that, you have the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. You can't underappreciate the significance of that for little Ireland. I appreciate Ireland, a country of some 5 million people. It's the size of a large city. But the implications of the UK's withdrawal from the EU and from the global scene in a certain way has raised major questions for Ireland's position geopolitically. And indeed, you also see in the United States, Ireland maintains very strong links with President Biden, who's a proud Irish American. But who knows what's going to happen in November rather. And so Ireland has to now understand that it's in a different geopolitical position. War in Ukraine, UK withdrawal, potential US withdrawal. And this is driving towards the final point I wanted to make. There's war in Europe, but just before, in the months leading up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Ireland undertook a root and branch assessment of its of its armed forces. There was a commission on the future of the defence forces in Ireland. Without getting too much into the long grass, this was a government-sponsored study of where Ireland stood in terms of its security context. And the top-line conclusions were that Ireland is unable to defend itself with its current military setup. We have a very proud and much loved armed forces associated with providing peacekeeping support and kind of doing good deeds around the world. But when it comes to defending our considerable exclusive economic zone, the huge seas that Ireland has, it's nothing on the seas of Indonesia, I appreciate, but for little Ireland, the kind of the zone of the sea that we have to be responsible for, we don't have a fully working radar system. We rely on support from Britain to understand what's happening in our skies. That all of this led to an understanding that Ireland's military was run down and underfunded, and there was wide public acceptance of the need to better fund and support our military. So I'm going to conclude just to say neutrality has been around for 100 years. There is a strong attachment to it because it is associated with independence from Britain. It's associated with Ireland's kind of anti-imperialist, being a country of the global north with features of the global south. So there's strong attachments to it. But this sense of the precarious security position in Europe, and indeed the fact that we are unable to defend ourselves, quote unquote, it has put the question of neutrality into public discourse. And so it is still settled. Ireland is neutral, but just to say the public opinion is shifting in important directions, which I'm happy to discuss further, that the question of Irish neutrality is being discussed seriously by serious people again. So Ireland is still neutral, but the question is up for grabs now.
Yes, yes. Thank you for that. I was just
Pleasure.
in Finland recently, and they had totally shifted from policy of neutrality towards joining NATO as a result of the Russian invasion, and the number was like 80% supportive of Finland joining NATO. So I think that same debate might be happening in Ireland.
Most
but
certainly.
now
But if I'm going to say really briefly, and it'll be 10 seconds, the two main differences that Ireland and Finland obviously is proximity to Russia. Needless to say, the 3,000 long kilometer border they share with Russia, but also Finland has always had one of the best armies in Europe. Finland can mobilize over 1 million people or something. You might know the quote, but just in terms of military capacity, Finland have always had a fine army, whereas Ireland has a fine army, but it's just much smaller in scale. So context is a little different.
Yes, thank you. Let me now turn to Broto, and at some point I'm going to call on Ambassador Padraig to jump in. But Pak Broto, thanks for joining us here. And just recently, the president just sent aid to Palestinians in Gaza, 30 billion rupiah, which is I think about $2 million, just north of $2 million. And as you know, this is the hardest issue in Indonesia that captures political establishment as well as public imagination. But I want to ask, what is your assessment to what extent can Indonesia really affect the dynamics of conflict between Israel and Palestine? I'm asking you this because there's a perception that Southeast Asia is on the secondary line relative to the countries in the Middle East when it comes to Israel-Palestine conflict. Yeah, what is your assessment of that?
Thank you, Pak Dino, for having me. The first thing when we talk about Indonesia's role or possible Indonesia's role in the future in this conflict, I think we have to be realistic with one stumbling block. The fact that we do not have any intensive contacts, not necessarily diplomatic relationship with Israel, would be one of the major stumbling blocks. That's the first thing. So if we want to do something more than what we have done in the past, I think we need to find a way, at least to get an intensive contact with them. Because the problem with humanitarian aid is not the amount of the aid that we have or we deliver, but how we make sure that we can deliver them to those in Gaza. That is the problem. And if we want to, basically, if we want to get that done, then the first thing that we we have to do is basically to have a good communication with the Israeli government or Israeli authorities, because on the ground, they are the one who take control. So that is the first thing. And the second issues that I want to raise is basically when we talk about Palestinian issues in Indonesia, we tend to consider this in the sense of we have sort of brotherhood, a religious brotherhood with them, which means we are talking about the Muslim brotherhood that we have with the Palestinian people. But if we use this kind of perspective in supporting Palestinian, we have to realize that 15 to 20% of Indonesian population are non-Muslim. And most of them are also a huge supporter of Palestinian independence. So I think we need to have a solid idea of on what basis are we basically supporting Palestine and also Palestinian independence. So in that sense, we will not have any internal debate on whether we should use religious institution, for example, and we will be able to enlarge our support for government's activities. So I think that is the two important issues when we talk about this conflict, basically.
Thank you. How do you see things playing out of this present standoff that we see? Yeah. But what do you see things playing out in the near future?
If we look into the conflict itself, it seems that the Israeli government will not comply to any resolution calling for ceasefire or stopping the hostilities in Gaza. That for sure. So for me, it seems that the Israeli government will really do all that they can do right now to eliminate Hamas. That's the first thing. So the question is not whether Hamas will be eliminated or not in the near future, but the problem is what will we do after that? So let's say Israel managed to gain their political victory, eliminating Hamas or substantially creating damage to Hamas capability. What will we do with the people in Gaza? For sure, we are talking about reconstruction in Gaza, but who will take in charge of it? So I think Indonesia has to really consider the possibility of we becoming an important actor in the reconstruction of Gaza as soon as this conflict ends. That's the first thing. Then the question is how are we going to do it? We have two options. The first one is, of course, we work together with Israel, which is politically unfeasible for us in Indonesia. But the second thing that we can do is basically to create international collaboration with like-minded countries or with great powers for the reconstruction of Gaza after the war. And then after that, we can talk about what kind of proposal, what kind of peace proposal are we going to propose to both Palestinian and Israeli. There was a question about should we maintain two-state solution? For me, two-state solution remain the best option that we have right now. But our approach to two-state solution in the past has been dominated by political and security consideration. If we shape the idea of two-state solution working from non-political aspect, let's say how to develop Palestine, how to engage with development, or how to create economic opportunities for the Palestinians. I think there is more feasible solution that we can offer. So despite the fact that we criticize the Trump vision for prosperity ideas, the basis that he used when he developed that proposal is actually makes sense. The problem that we have right now is if today Palestine become an independent country, will they be able to fulfill or to provide economic needs of the Palestinian people? This is a big question. I mean, independence is one thing, but you can actually delivering the wealth to the people is another issue. So this is what I mean with we need to really think in terms of stages. The first stage that we have to think right now is what will we do once the conflict is finished? What kind of reconstruction plan that we will bring or we will propose? And then after that, we have to think about what kind of two-state solution proposal that we are going to propose. And my proposal is we have to work from economic or development issues. And then after that, we are thinking about how we're going to do that. And international collaboration for me, in the case of Indonesia, well, that is the only option that we have.
Thank you. Let me turn now to Pak Nostalgiawan Wahyudi. Thank you for joining us here, Pak. Look, I agree that two-state solution is the best solution on the table. But my criticism to my Palestinian friends, and we told them this, by the way, is that, look, you guys need to get your act together too. You Fatah and Hamas, you need to work together. You need to unite. You spend too much time fighting among each other. And Indonesian experience was that it was only when all the factions united in Indonesia that we were able to secure independence in 1945 onward, right? So I'm just I want to get your take also on this two-state solution. Are we moving farther away from this, or are we or are we getting closer? I don't think we're getting any closer, but what is your assessment there?
Okay, first thing that we have to know about one thing, Indonesia may focus after the adoption of Resolution 27 and 28 is a short-term agenda to push urgent humanitarian action in Gaza. And we have also experience to collaborate and unite several factions in Indonesia. But in these near days, humanitarian action is the major focus that the people of Gaza need our help and our fund and our calm heart maintaining to them. As we know that humanitarian situation in Gaza reached an emergency level. While our focus on achieving ceasefire and ending the conflict, but it is also crucial to address the urgent need of civilian population in Gaza, particularly a huge refugee in Rafah. And we must provide immediate assistance, actually, to those suffering from acute hunger, critical health conditions, and lack of medical supplies and medications. And it is imperative to us that we can work diplomatically to ensure that the aid reaches those who need in Gaza. And Indonesia, for the next step, need to push to full opening of the border of the Rafah immediately to allow delivery of humanitarian aid on large scales, because we have in a situation that the people of Gaza, in their limited access to this food and healthcare. And also, this is important to ensure that delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza is not attacked and or disrupted by Israel military in any way. And while also prioritizing the safety of medical personnel, it's also important, and international humanitarian volunteers also important during their work in Gaza. And this is true. I agree with Pak Broto that we have to collaborate with all parties involved to find a lasting solution to this crisis. And for the long term, Indonesia has to expand our diplomatic work to major countries, particularly the countries on the United Nations that have a veto, such as China, Russia in one side, and US, of course, in other side, to ensure that Israel has no other way than adapting the resolution of 27 and 28, Pak Dino.
Thank you. And do you think that between the West and the global South now there's a wider divide politically and diplomatically due to their responses to the Gaza situation? Yeah.
I think no. In current situations between West and our counterpart in Southeast Asia, I think we share the same opinions and the same situation that what has been done in Israel is beyond our expectations. This is beyond our humanitarian conditions that we have to protect our people actually in Palestine and in Gaza. And to this, we can see that even in Ireland government also can see clearly that the situation in Gaza is different, and it also can be part of injustice and also political genocide or political apartheid that has been done by Israel. And the difference between our counterpart in Southeast Asia and the Western in Europe or America might be the political approach. And every country, as we know, has our our focus and our interests that we may share a different approach to Israel, for example. And in current situations, there is no reason for most of the country, as we see also in the United Nations Security Council, 14 countries approve the resolution, and only American still abstains for this condition. But what American do to this situation is very interesting, I think. This is for the first time, in my opinion, America take a side with Israel, and the United abstain in the resolution. I think this is a good viewpoint that we can take account that America starting to look the viewpoint of neighboring nations, and there is a perception and common understanding that the U.S. has a tendency to be a full supporter of Israel, and in any UN resolutions, everyone also and we know that maybe some data around 2015 to 2022, there is around 140 UN resolutions. And this number is relatively huge compared to 68 resolutions at the same years spread to other countries. And most of the resolutions is accompanied strictly by the US, and even US tend to veto any strong resolution applied to Israel. And this resolution applied with no consequences, I think. And we know that the resolution of 27 and 28 is necessarily able to force Israel to cease fire. Everyone doubt about it. And even after the adoption of a resolution of 27 and 28, Israel, as we know, bravely in front of Pentagon, still has desire to fully attack the Rafah. And this is we know that many of the resolution has been break by Israel with no consequences. No, even not a single UN resolution has been respected by Israel. And Israel withdrew from the current negotiation in Doha, Qatar, as one day after the U.S. abstained in the United Nations Security Council resolution.
Yes.
This Israel considered that Hamas demands may be difficult to meet, to be delusional, and that indicate Hamas in the view of Israel not interested in the agreement that proposed by Israel.
Yeah. Okay,
I
I'm
think this
gonna cut you there.
agreement.
Okay, thank you
Okay,
very
okay.
much. Let me go to thank you very much for that, Dr. Barry. You know, I saw I saw a YouTube or Instagram reel recently where they put clothes of women and children who had been killed as innocent collateral. Sorry, that's the wrong word. Innocent victims of the bombings done by Israel in Gaza. And what really moved me was that when they put their clothes side by side, it would take 5 kilometers long, right? So that means if you put bodies of women and children who had been killed by Israel during the Gaza bombing, it would stretch for 5 kilometers, right? And that's really terrible. And you know, the West had always acted conscientiously, right? And in Rwanda, although a bit late, right? But eventually they did act in Serbia and in many places. But for some reason, in Gaza, that seemed to be the exception. You know, with all the visuals about the women and children in massive scale dying indiscriminately. It took such difficulty for Western positions to move of many Western governments, and this including the United States, of course, right? Can you share with us, as somebody who live in the Western world, you know, notwithstanding Ireland's, you know, strong position on this, what explains this? We just fail to understand sometimes why this exception on the case of Gaza to act in a consistent way, and they see all the images, the same thing that we see, right? But how come things did not move in the right way and soon enough? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I mean, that's such a stark image. What you describe, this idea of the bodies laid head to toe and stretching for that distance. It's almost difficult to speak when you talk in such vivid terms. But I'm going to do my best. You're correct to say that the context in Ireland a little bit different to the center of gravity, at least in Europe. But I'll do my best to try and explain why I think that is the case, and I'll do so looking at from two angles. One is just sheer proximity, and then the second we'll look at history, and it's a fraught bit of history which I'll tread through very lightly. So in terms of proximity, perhaps you're thinking, Chair, about the different reactions to the conflict in Ukraine compared to the conflict in Gaza, because I think that's a fair question to raise, because in terms of scale, they're at least equivalent. Purely in terms of politics, we know this. In terms of proximity, Ukraine shares borders with European countries. It is an EU candidate. The Ukrainians speak a Slavic language, and there are Ukrainians spread throughout the European Union already. So that conflict, both physically but also politically and socially, was closer to home. So the EU's response to the conflict in Ukraine was more organized and coordinated. But I should say what's very important to understand is how unique and how new a thing that is at all when it comes to any conflict. If we reach back to the 90s, and I'll do so only very briefly, looking at the conflict in Southeastern Europe with the falling asunder of the former Yugoslavia and the terrible internecine conflict there, the EU was also unable to organize a coordinated response. It was a US-led mission under the presidency of Bill Clinton, which initially brought about the end of that terrible conflict through intervention. So the response to Ukraine is rather new, and it's indicative of how seriously that conflict is perceived. The further east you go, so I'm talking to you from Dublin, which is on Europe's western flank, but I have spent time recently in Eastern Europe. I spend a good portion of my time. And the closer you go to the Russian border and to the conflict with Ukraine, the more seriously that conflict is perceived, which is why it is more central to the public discourse. So I think that's an easy enough one to understand. Undergraduate level, proximity to conflict generally makes it more central to the public discourse. But obviously, and I think everybody on the call will appreciate that there's historical legacies there when it comes to Europe and the Middle East, the colonies and mandates that were strewn across the Middle East, where European powers had responsibility for different parts of different parts of the region. But also, obviously, World War II, the atrocities of the Holocaust, and the establishment of the State of Israel. Ireland, I said in my opening remarks, was neutral. So Ireland was not a direct party to the conflict per se, but most European countries were. And so this creates strong legacy associations between European countries and Israel. Indeed, many of the people who moved to Israel in its opening decades came from Europe and further afield as well. But there's just been very, very strong associations between European capitals and Israel. But I'll say maybe two further things. One is the European Council met last week. Now, the European Council is one of the 7 European Union institutions. The famous remark about when you call Europe, who do you call? Because power is distributed across the different institutions of this experiment in regional politics that the European Union is. The European Council is the coming together of all of the heads of state and government. So it is the apex politically. So it is where President Macron of France and Chancellor Scholz of Germany and all of the heads of government come to meet. And at that meeting, after the meeting, there's always council conclusions. So the meetings are not minuted, they take place in camera, but there's a specific note that is distributed afterwards to reflect what was discussed. And about a third of the time over a 2-day discussion with these very, very busy people was dedicated to the conflict in Ukraine and the Middle East. So there is absolutely a sense, by Middle East, I mean Gaza, there's absolutely a sense that greater attention has been paid, at least politically, to the conflict. But it's really important to understand that there is an increasing disparity between public opinion, which in many countries in Europe, including the likes of France and Germany, is increasingly tilting towards solidarity with Palestine, or however you want to put it, probably best described as revulsion with the level, scale, and disproportionality of the conflict taking place in Gaza. So public opinion is shifting closer towards the Irish position, which creates strain between national governments and publics in some European countries. But the final point I wanted to make on this about how to understand why the response to Gaza and the conflict there is fairly received in places like Jakarta and Indonesia as slow or not as dynamic as the response to the war in Ukraine. To speak candidly, it's at that sort of moment where your friends need to speak to you most candidly and most seriously. So these countries that are allies of Israel, Israel is a liberal democracy in the Middle East. It has extremely strong fraternal links with many European countries. And as I say, strong bonds of family, of society, of politics, of kinship. And it's those sorts of people that need to stand up and say, this conflict has gone too far. The devastation, the violence, the destruction, what you started, Chair, with your opening remarks, the 5 kilometers of dead bodies of women and children, just the sheer scale of the conflict. It's now for European capitals to speak up to a friend in Israel and say that perhaps this conflict now needs to be ended and ended immediately. So I think that was just a little personal note, I guess, and I should just reiterate the 2 points I was making, which is that due to the proximity, the fact that Ukraine is right on Europe's borders, the EU's training mission, which is helping to prepare Ukrainian soldiers to fight in the war against Russia, is in Poland. It's on European soil, and European governments are supporting it and helping to train and fund and resource the Ukrainian military. Whereas the conflict in Gaza is just at a remove. Cyprus being an exception, the most eastern point of the European Union, and Ireland obviously is relatively close to the conflict in Gaza, but aside from that, proximity does play a factor in terms of how conflicts are perceived. Then I also made this point about history, just the devastation of World War II. Indeed, it was the essence or the impulse that brought the European Union into being, this conflict that laid most European countries, most European capitals in ruins, and the kind of devastation that went with that. The strong links with Israel date back to those times, and they're very strong and they're very durable, which is why I think the response was the way that it was, as you described.
Thank you. I think Ambassador of Ireland, Padraig, is here. Are you here, Padraig?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, if you don't mind me asking you a question. And by the way, that's very nice batik. We're gonna have to send one to Barry also, the Indonesian batik. Yeah. So,
Thank you.
Padraig, what kind of representation has the government of Ireland made to Israel? Because you know, there's an Israeli embassy in Dublin, and I suppose there's an Ireland embassy in Ramla, and so on. So what kind of representation has been made? And also, I understand there will be a vote in the UN to decide the full membership of Palestine in the UN. And how will Ireland vote? And if maybe Pak Broto or Nostalgiawan also tell us how do you think Indonesia will vote in question? Please, Padraig.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And first of all, just on the question of, as it were, diplomatic relations, we have full diplomatic relations with Israel. We have an embassy in Tel Aviv. There is an Israeli embassy in Dublin. We are in regular contact with the Israeli government, and our ministers have very frequently visited Israel. And throughout our relationship, which has not always been easy, but I think it's been very important for us to be frank. You know, we support a two-state solution. We believe that that is the only way for Israel and Palestine to live side by side in peace and security. That is necessary, and we just have, from the very start of this particular conflict in Gaza, going back to October, but also for decades before that, we have spoken frankly to the Israeli government and the Israeli people, recognizing, of course, the right of the state to exist, but having things to say that we feel strongly about, and in particular the treatment of Palestinians. I mean, Barry, I think, laid out a lot of the historical background to this very clearly. I mean, this is an issue that resonates with the people of Ireland very strongly, our own experience as a colonized state. And in particular, a lot of our experience of colonization was about land expropriation and land being taken, ownership of land being taken away from people. So the experience of Palestinians over most of the last century has really resonated a lot with Irish people. Barry also spoke about hunger, and that plays a very large part in the Irish historical and social imagination. So when we look at what's been happening in Gaza, of course, there's the initial revulsion over the violence, over so many deaths and injuries, and the immiseration and destruction of so much of Gaza. But then what has become more and more of an issue in the last weeks and months is increasing hunger and starvation, which is where we're at. And Gaza is definitely on the brink of famine. And the word famine resonates very strongly with Irish people. So we have, as it were, the concern of the Irish people over the violence, and now we've just entered a new phase. So we have been consistently calling for a ceasefire. In the immediate terms, that was to protect the welfare of people of Gaza, so to prevent injury and death. But now there is a very strong added element of wanting to allow full humanitarian access, and we have recently seen that that ceasefire to allow humanitarian access is more important than ever. So yes, I think Barry touched on the main points, but I just want to make it clear this is an issue that historically has been very important to a long series of Irish governments and will continue to be so for future governments, because it is something on which there is very broad consensus across the political and social system in Ireland. And then just on the question of recognition of Palestine at the United Nations, but elsewhere, we very much look forward to being able to do that when Palestine is able to manage this itself. And this is something we've been in contact with a lot of other partners in the European Union, trying to aim towards doing a joint action, as it were. And I think, in going back to something previous speakers have said, but in particular Barry, we are seeing how public opinion is shifting in states, in European Union states. While there was, of course, and after the initial Hamas attacks, a huge amount of sympathy for Israel having been so brutally attacked and its people so brutally attacked. Now, just because of the deaths upon deaths upon deaths over the last few months, the public opinion in Europe, in our European Union member states, is shifting, and that is definitely going to have an increasing impact on the policies of governments. So while Ireland, maybe within the European Union, might be seen as a bit of an outlier or a bit of an extreme position on Palestine, on Gaza, I think the center of gravity is moving and has been moving for some time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Let me ask Pak Broto this question. FPCI, we are very active on promoting Abrahamic relations between Muslims, Christians, and Jewish people around the world. We have a very strong program on that. But I'm really getting worried that the present Israel-Gaza conflict, as the Secretary General has said, has the great risk of enhancing anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in some parts of the world. And I think if we look at the media reports in the US or in Europe, in some parts of Asia, you do see dramatic rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Yeah. I'm just wondering if you have any comment on this, if this is something that you worry about, and how do we ensure that any resolution or management of the Israel-Palestine conflict is also accompanied by much greater, much reduced Islamophobia and anti-Semitism around the world.
Yeah. The first thing that we have to basically realize is this conflict is not religious conflict. That's the first thing. When we talk about Abrahamic accord or Abrahamic relationship, we are basically trying to create solidity under the banner of humanity. So I think that is the first thing. In terms of what happened recently with the rise of both anti-Semitism and also Islamophobia, I don't really think that will be an issue. Why? I always believe that the power lies in the public, basically. So when we talk about what happened in Gaza, we have to take into consideration that the current Israeli government is basically the hardliner government. So when they take action, they are not doing it in the name of the whole Israeli people as well. So I think we have to keep giving praises to Israeli government in that sense. That is my thought on that. But in the case of Indonesia, I find something interesting, basically, Pak Dino. In the past, when we talk about this issue in Indonesia, we have mostly heard what the Muslim community have to say in the past. But recently, if you go into social media platform that the younger generation use, X and then Instagram, even TikTok, and so on and so forth, then you will realize that there has been an increasing trend of supporting Palestinian Israeli cause within the Indonesian younger generation. So I think I tend to see this as the younger generation are more rational in putting these issues, in seeing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the right perspective. So that is what I think with the Indonesian younger generation and their perception of this conflict. So for me, it is basically a good sign. So I would not be really worried about the disruption in interreligious relation due to this conflict. I think our younger generation has realized that this is not really a religious issue. So this is an issue between Israeli elites and also Palestinian elite as well, which unfortunately Palestinian people are stuck in the middle of this rivalry between the Israeli elites and also Palestinian elites.
Thank you for that. And I agree with you. This is definitely not a religious conflict, and we should always take care to say very clearly that this has nothing to do with Islam and Judaism. But somehow, unfortunately, look, I was in Davos 2 months ago, I think, and I attended a session on anti-Semitism. And the Jewish speaker in that session said that anti-Semitism was at the highest level since World War II, according to him. And I was just reading a report in Indonesian media. The American Islam Council in the US said that the number of Islamophobia in the US is the highest ever in the last 30 years, right? So I think there is a serious uptick on this issue. And again, Arab-Israeli conflict is not political, it's not religious, right? But for some reason, some people somewhere are interpreting it as such, and we should always be very clear that it's not a religious issue, it's very much a political issue. But I'm also involved in some Abrahamic initiatives undertaken with some parties in the Middle East, and they are lamenting that there's hardly anyone internationally who's actually taking care of this issue of the Abrahamic tension that now is taking place, right? So that is definitely something that we need to work on. I do want to ask Pa Wahyudi again. I want to get after this Barry's comment on this, which is if we all understand that two-state solution is very important formula to resolve the conflict, who's carrying the water on this? You know, the Americans say yes, two-state solution, but they're not saying, hey, we will mediate. You know, neither the Indonesian is saying that. They say a two-state solution, but nobody's coming forward saying, hey, I will mediate. Yeah, and the Saudi also, nobody is doing this, right? Unlike in the past where you did have people who came forward to mediate, right? So the question is, how do we move to state for a solution when nobody is willing to carry the water on this issue? Yeah. So Wahyudi first, and then I would like to get Barry's comment. Yeah, and then there's a question from Satrio, which I will from the chat group that I will ask after this. Yeah, Wahyudi, yeah.
Thank you, Pak Dino. As we know that two-state solution is our main political approach to conflict in Palestine and Gaza, but Indonesia as a country actually can be a support to major powers, US and also Russia and also China and also the international institution like United Nations to push this kind of political initiative to be implemented and to be realized in Palestine. And as our part, Indonesian, we have like a strong commitment and responsible because Palestinian actually the only one country participate in Asia Africa Independence Conference that to support a country to be independent in the world. Then only Palestine is not independent yet. And based on this, we have to link actually for Indonesian support to this. First, we have to OIC organizations, and we know our foreign minister leading with several foreign ministers from OIC member countries to make a lobby approach to major power, and it should be expanded actually to another regional power such as ASEAN, European Union, African Union, and or even Union of South American nations to gain more massive political. After this political approach, I think we can sit together in United Nations that are part of the conflict, including Palestinian, Hamas, and also Israel, can follow this kind of resolution to make a peace in Palestine. And on the side, we have ASEAN actually. We are losing to make ASEAN can be fruitful as a representative of institution in Southeast Asia, that as ASEAN to be like more silence in responding these issues. But yes, this is true that ASEAN have intervention motion, but the changing of international politics around the world must be responded by ASEAN actually. Then and for this sake, Indonesia can propose to ASEAN make some like ministerial meeting or ACC ASEAN Coordinating Council to make joint statement and also proposal to United Nations and also Israel or even Palestinian to sit together and discussing about this kind of proposal to state solution can be implemented together. And no one country in the world can implement this one except these two countries can accept the proposal. And we know the US accepted and partly of Palestinian accepted, but Israel and Hamas is never accepted this proposal. So this is very hard for us to impose this kind of approach, and either in this part of the conflict, Israel and also Hamas is not accept this proposal.
Thank you. I think it will be very difficult for ASEAN to be involved in the Arab-Israeli conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict. To be honest, and it's just too far away, and it's something that we don't have much experience on. But I want to turn to Pa Barry. In my view, even the Americans usually are very involved in this. They have mediated the Israel-Palestine negotiations before, but somehow I feel that they just don't have the political and diplomatic energy to get their feet wet too far on this. I mean, would you agree with that? And if you do, who would step up? Because the Israeli and Palestine, they're not gonna negotiate it by themselves. Somebody need to be in the middle of it.
Absolutely. I think your analysis is correct, Padino, about the US. I think they're overstretched. The domestic political context wouldn't allow it. And also the US as an honest broker in this conflict, given its close association with one of the parties, I think would disqualify them from carrying the water. A couple of thoughts that relate to the Irish context that I think are helpful in answering your question on who carries the water. So Ireland is really committed to a two-state solution, as the ambassador has said. Ireland is committed to the rule of law and international law, human rights. And you might have picked up from my opening remarks that unusually Ireland was the first country to call for the two-state solution in 1980. 2014 passed through Parliament that this was something that the Irish state should call for, yet it hasn't happened. Why? There's essentially two reasons in my analysis. One is that what the government often says is little Ireland, 5 million people, a small player even within the EU context, needs to move forward with friends, that there needs to be a block of countries to move together to have any real influence. So what we discussed about the discussions at the UN may be pertinent. But also, and I think this is often unsaid, but it's very clear, that there's fear of legitimizing the status quo, right? With settlements and with the kind of inability of the Palestinian Authority to fulfill the requirements of statehood, of having a established territory, governing its people, and being recognized by other countries. So Irish support for Palestine, and not just for Palestine, also for Ukraine or other places, is very often diplomatic, and it's in lieu of kind of hard military support, for example, but diplomatic support is potent, as we know. So I would like to think that there is a role for Europeans. I think Ireland, in my remarks at the start, its close affiliation in juxtaposition to the US with one of the parties would probably disqualify it. But there might be a role for example, Norway. The Oslo Accords in 1993 obviously were mediated there. And I just want to give a couple of thoughts now on, I'll conclude in one area of agreement with the previous speaker, but I just want to share some thoughts on the Good Friday Agreement. So the Good Friday Agreement is the peace treaty which established a durable peace in Northern Ireland, the conflict which waged there from the 1960s through to the 1990s, but it was the kind of late stage, the end point of a conflict that lasted for centuries. It established institutions. It was established through multi-party talks. So all different parties were represented. It was mediated by people from all over the world. So there was representation from America, from Europe, from Africa. But the real ingredient, the key ingredient, was political leadership from within the communities. So you can have all the mediators that you want, or all the mediators that you can have, but what you need is talent and commitment and sympathy and intelligence from political leaders within the parts, within Palestine and with Israel. And obviously in the white heat of this terrible conflict, it's going to be difficult to find those people, but I actually think that's the right question to ask rather than who can mediate, because you can't mediate unless you have that local leadership. And the secret sauce, if there is one, that has allowed the Good Friday Agreement to sustain in Northern Ireland, notwithstanding its many faults and its many false starts, is that people in that country, people in that region, people in the north of Ireland can identify as Irish, as British, as both, or as neither. So this idea of statehood, Ireland is, and I am, fundamentally attached to the idea of a two-state solution. But this should not be without imagination, that there should be, the idea of statehood is rather new to most states in the world. If we were to take a kind of a longue durée view of human evolution, that the idea of what counts as a state now being what will count for a state in a century, I think is folly. So I think it's important to take lessons from the Good Friday Agreement, where there was this leadership and this imagination, to make that context work by allowing people to identify in different ways, to sweep the border away. That was obviously, unfortunately, imperiled by the UK's withdrawal, but that is for another day. But this idea of allowing people to identify in different ways and to coexist peacefully and to have power sharing is really what made peace break out and be essentially sustained in Northern Ireland. And I'll conclude, I think, in agreement with the previous speaker. I think there has to be a role for regional players. I would like to think the EU, Palestine is essentially, and Israel is essentially in the EU's region. I would like to think the EU would have a role, a positive role, in defending the principles set out in Articles 2 and 3 of the EU treaties regarding protection of minorities and the human rights and the social market economy that the EU is built on. But I regret to say I think it will be difficult for consensus to break out, given what I said about the different affinities, the different attachments between European countries and the Middle East. So for me, I point towards entities like the GCC and regional players in the Middle East who will be best placed, who would have the regional context, regional knowledge to mediate some kind of future for this terrible conflict.
Thank you. And I think that leads us very nicely to a question, the last question from Satrio in Indonesia, who asks, how do you see the role or lack of role coming from regional organizations in the Middle East? And I pose this question either to Pak Broto or Pak Nostalgiawan. Either one of you want to respond to this?
Uh, uh, This is something that
Okay,
I found
yeah.
interesting, basically, Pak Dino. When we talk about the role of regional organization in the Middle East, for example, in this conflict, there has been a change, basically, in their attitude. OIC, they still maintain their normative position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And then the Arab state countries, the Arab League, uh, they have been slightly taking a different position, basically. So in the past, they seems to be committed to these Palestinian independent issues, but recently they kind of neglecting this call. One of the reason I think is because there's also a change within the Arab population itself. So in the past, when Arab people talks about Palestine and also Palestinian independence, they've been very ideological in that sense. But nowadays, they're more pragmatic. And I think that is also one of the reasons why they decided to engage Israel closely in the last few years. So if we look into whether this regional organization will play a role in it, I don't think so. And it's also related to your question, who will carry the water? I think we still need the elephant or the elephants in the house. So basically, when you talk about giving or finding solution for Palestinian-Israeli conflict, it takes both resources and also commitment. So the problem with resources is only a handful of countries, only a handful of states has the resources. And the second is commitment. I always think that Indonesian public, they're always eager for Indonesia to play a role in this conflict resolution. They always talk about it. Our government always talk about it. We keep saying that we will do our best and so on and so forth. But I don't really understand whether we in Indonesia, we realize the complexity of what we call as two-state solution. So I'm not really sure that we really, even those in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, I'm not really sure that they understand what the implication of two-state solution. And as far as I concern, I never heard that our government work in details about two-state solution. So it is only a political campaign that we give to our people. It's only a political slogan. So that is different with what the Norway have done in the past. They really consider what is the best possible scheme for two-state solution, and they propose it with the support of the US. So that is something that we are lacking now. We do not have the resources, or countries with resources, they do not have the commitment. So I don't think it is a task for certain countries, but it is a task for multiple countries that both willingly to spare the resources and committed to these issues. So I think that's one.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Pak Broto. I would love to continue this conversation, but unfortunately, we have to end it because our friends who are fasting need to prepare to break their fast. But let me just say this in the end. Look, Indonesia, we had the conflict in Aceh. And I was involved in that on the government side. And there was just terrible human rights violations and bloody killings by both sides. And each killing would generate the next killing from the other side and would generate the next retaliation from the other side. And the cycle would go on and on for 20 years. It took the life of thousands of people, yeah. And you know what broke that, right? What broke that cycle? very simple, political solution, right? The peaceful negotiations, compromise, political solution mediated by CMI in Finland, right? And because of that political solution, the cycle of violence just ended until now, yeah, despite all the imperfections that still happen in Aceh. And the same thing with Northern Ireland, right? I was a diplomat, a junior diplomat in London back then, and I could just experience and watch the killings, the violence done by both sides, right? And it would happen until today, unless a peace deal, political solution was achieved, which was achieved in Northern Ireland, right? Miraculously, right? So I think that is the mindset that we have for Israel-Palestine conflict, that the present situation is not tenable. It cannot be allowed to go on. And the cycle of violence, whether it's the Hamas attack on 7th of October and then Israel retaliation presently in Gaza, and many people have pointed out, for every woman and children and sons and daughters killed, they generate 10 times more fighters fighting against those who killed their brothers or sisters, right? So the only way to break that cycle is, from the Indonesian experience, is political solution, worked out by both sides. And also, this is what we saw in Northern Ireland, right? So I just want to put it out there as a note, and to thank Barry. You have new friends now in Indonesia, and anything that we can do for you, please let us know. We'd love to have more conversations. I think Barry and Patrick, I see the Irish people as the Batak people of Europe. Yeah, I don't know if you know what Batak is. In Indonesia, there's an ethnic group, Batak, and they are very straightforward. They don't miss words. They say what's on their mind, right? They're very vocal, very argumentative. A lot of Batak people become lawyers, actually, in Indonesia. So when I listen to you, I see a Batak of Europe, right? So again, and thank you for Pak Broto and Nostalgia One for your very valuable contribution, and we'll definitely continue this conversation. Thank you, and I give it back to the MC.
Thank you, Dr. Ino, for moderating today's discussion. And thank you to all the distinguished panelists for sharing your valuable insights. And with that, today's discussion has been concluded. Today's event will be available for rewatch on FPCI's official YouTube channel at Secretariat FPCI. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to today's discussion on Building Bridges, Indonesia and Ireland Perspectives on the War in Gaza. Don't forget to follow our social media handles at FPC Indo for more information about our activities, events, and programs. See you at the next FPCI event and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.